Thank you, Stephen. A number of guests duly introduced by fellows beg leave to attend your meeting. Is it your pleasure that I welcome them in your name? Thank you. Minutes.
Ordinary meeting, Thursday, the 12th of February, 2026, Burlington House and online. Professor Martin Millett, President, in the chair. The minutes of the ordinary meeting of Thursday, the 5th of February, 2026 were read and signed. The Honorary Secretary read the name of a new fellow who was admitted to the Society, Martin Weeds. The following communication was then laid before the Society. The emergence of civilization and the Maghreb, new discoveries at the later prehistoric Eid Bet, Morocco, by Professor Cyprian Broodbank, FSA, and Dr. Julian Lucarini. Thanks were returned for this communication. The President announced that the next meeting will be on Thursday, February the 19th, 2026, and then adjourned the meeting. A reception followed.
Is it your pleasure that I sign these minutes as a true and complete record? Thank you. We now come to the main business of this evening's meeting, which is to hear our lecture. Our lecturer this evening is Dan Hicks, Fellow, who is Professor of Contemporary Archaeology at Oxford University, Curator of World Archaeology at the Pitt Rivers Museum, and a Fellow of St. Cross College. He's written widely on art, heritage, museums, colonialism, and material culture in the recent past and indeed in the near present. Dan's books include the British Museum, the Benin Bronzes, Colonial Violence and Cultural Restitution, 2020, and last year, Every Monument Will Fall, a story of remembering and forgetting. Dan is speaking this evening with the title, The Unfinished Story of the Worcester College Skull-Cup. Welcome, Dan.
Okay, wonderful to be here. And so we now have to wait while this screen descends, I'm advised. So while we're doing so, maybe I can say thank you so much for this invitation to Martin, Natasha, and the whole team at the Antiques. As a former trustee of this institution, it's very nice to be back. I'm not in London for these meetings as often as I would like to be, but it is absolutely great to be here. And welcome those of you who are here for the first time, because I think we've got some guests as well for the talk. So in the time available to me, I'm just trying to set my alarm for that, which is about 40 minutes or so, I'm going to talk to you about this history, but also try to set it into a wider context and to try to take the temperature of some of the terms that a lot of us have heard about, what the book talks about as the 4 A's. It's a term from Tim Ingold, in fact, the relationship between archaeology, anthropology, art, and architecture. We've heard a lot of talk about those institutions and their relationships with imperialism, with forms of supremacism, and so on. This talk engages with those histories of the 4 A's through the 4 M's. The 4 M's are monuments, memory, militarism, and there is a fourth, which I can't remember at this precise moment, but we will move on to it. So let's maybe start with the context in Oxford of the enduring nature of imperialism, forms of imperialism from the 19th century, which really, came to a head sort of 10 years ago, really, with the Rose Must Fall Oxford campaign. So I think it's right to say that in institutions like Oxford, I work at the Pitt Rivers Museum at the university, but at scores of other institutions across this country, across Europe, around the world, 3 long-standing grassroots, indigenous and African-led movements have found their way to the doors of these institutions and really, called into question some not of these histories, but of these enduring memory legacies, these enduring unfinished histories. And those movements are, on the one side, the restitution movement for the return of items looted in the later 19th century or early 20th century. They are the fallism movement for the shift in memory culture that can come when the veneration of enslavers and colonizers in the late 19th, early 20th century is sort of called into question, and those monuments are replaced or removed, or buildings are renamed, and so on. And third, the movement for the decolonization of knowledge. So ideas about what's in the libraries, what's being read. So whether it's in the museums with the cases of objects that were taken under empire, whether it's in the streets with conversations, arguments, and calls for the removal of statues, or whether it's in the libraries and the seminar rooms and spaces like this one, where the questions are who's being cited, what are these disciplines about, what is being sort of called into question. I argue in Every Monument Will Fall, those three movements are responding to a single historical entity, one for which we don't currently have a word, but an aesthetic, a movement, a use of art and culture for a particular set of ends, which we recognize when we see it. We recognize the general on the horse, the looted object in the case in the museum, the discipline invented that tells you, it is going to tell you about every culture in the world, every moment of the human past, and so forth. What's important about all of those entities is they emerge in a remarkably tight window of time between, let's say, the 1870s and the 1920s. So when we, in the summer of sort of 2020, saw the fall of an image of a man called Edward Colston in Bristol, we have to remember that this was not some random moment of iconoclasm to, alter the built environment of the city, but it was an intervention with memory culture that has a very specific history. Edward Colston lived between 1636 and 1721. He was dead for longer than he'd been alive by the time that in 1895 an image of him was erected on the docks, in Bristol, in order to celebrate a past of money made from enslavement and from certain forms of empire in that way that was being celebrated 2 generations or more later. And once you get your eye in, you realize that that date of 1895, or the erection of roads in 1911, or in the book I go into many other instances in London, in Cambridge, elsewhere in the world, the foundation of the Pitt Rivers itself in 1884. This is a 30 to 40 to 50 year period. It's a proto-fascist history of the use of art and culture in order to put across a certain image of, an ideological image of sort of cultural supremacism. So what I argue in the book is that we're very used now to talking about the co-option and the perversion of science, of natural history, in the 1850s in order to tell the racist lie that there were different species of human. In the 1940s and 50s, after the defeat of fascism, any last remnant of those displays were rightly removed from our science and natural history museums. But those museums which concern themselves not with natural history but cultural history have not yet dealt with those objects of art and culture that were in the subsequent generation, the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, used and obtained and taken and put on display for precisely the same purposes. And the disciplinary histories in which archaeology, antiquarianism emerged in different ways from the 1860s, 1870s, the way in which memory culture in the streets also changed as well, is really at the heart of the book. And the question is, of course, which I'm asking in this talk, which we're going to get into through not simply the metal and stone images of dead white men which are being contested in the streets, but also the physical human remains of people who still sit in cardboard boxes wrapped in acid-free tissue in our museums. The questions there relate not only to what happened in the past, but to how to deal with these legacies in the present. That is the question for Worcester College, Oxford, who are doing a very good job insofar as they can in terms of what the sector can tell them and advise them they might do. Equally, is the right thing to do what happened in the case of this image of Edward Colston, remembering that what I'm offering in the book is a name for that movement. I call it militarist realism. That's a form of militarism. I'm sure you can understand that sense of, saying that, the more violent elements of empire are part of what's being celebrated, objects taken from the battlefield, in the battlefields of empire, the sort of celebration of the major generals and so forth in the streets, but also that realism, which is realism in the way that Mark Fisher uses the word realism in his book, Capitalist Realism. That sense that there are certain forms of realism under which you can't imagine the world otherwise. Things seem like things can never change. That seemed to me a part of what this art movement, what this co-option of culture, something that all of us in this room who love museums, who love the disciplines in which we are trained, who think we can have value, public value in public art, we should all be concerned about, because we're living with these legacies of the co-option of our field for the purposes of putting forward certain images of ideology. What should we do in the present? Well, in Bristol, one answer was offered after the toppling of this image of Edward Colston. And let's remember, it's an image of Edward Colston. It's not actual Edward Colston. And you can often miss that when you hear the conversations about this. And that's how militarist realism works. Militarist realism, I argue in the book, is a sort of psyop. It's a psychological operation. It encourages people to make sort of two category errors. On the one side, we start off by mixing up the man and the monument. You start talking about this image of Colston, and before you know it, the conversation is about Edward Colston, right or wrong, the man himself, not the choice about whether you remember that man as a city and whether that is where the memory culture of that city, of the nation might be. But you also don't find yourself thereby not only mixing up the man and the monument, but also mixing up history and memory. And people tell you you're cancelling history if you make a shift in the memory culture, if you alter a single object in a display in a museum, if you change the reading list. Occasionally we read in some of the right-wing press that someone's trying to cancel Jane Austen because there might be an alteration in what is taught in English literature undergraduate degrees. This isn't cancellation. This is a choice about how we remember, how we think about ourselves, and the place of art and culture in the present. So what happened the day after Edward Colston's image fell? Well, our colleagues in Bristol got up really early in the morning the next day in the June of 2020, and they went down to the river, the harbour side, and they pulled this object back up. You can remember the full footage of the rolling of it along the street, sort of tied up in ropes, and the drowning of this lump of metal in the water. And they pulled it back up, and they took it to the conservation lab, and they fixed the paintwork of the graffiti so it will last. And they laid this image on its side, in the M Shed in one of the museums in the city of Bristol, in order to ask Colston right or wrong? What do we think of him? Let's have a conversation about him. For many activists, this was the worst of all options. This was not a campaign for another monument to this man, Edward Colston, taking up space yet again in the museum. That was not what was being campaigned for. So was that, as I wrote at the time in Art Review in a piece that I called Let's Keep Colston Falling, was this an act of decolonization, as some described it, or was it in some way an act of counterinsurgency, an act to say, well, you can remove the image, but let's still make this image, persist within the space of the museum. My personal view is that one might have, if it's important to take it out of the water, at least sort of put it with, as is the fate of so many other objects in our museums, not on a database, at the back of a warehouse somewhere, and then if someone really wants to see it, then maybe it can be dug out. But what sort of history is it being cancelled? The history of statues. Nothing that I can see is actually lost in that change. Now, nothing I've told you so far is really very new in terms of the wider literature. We can go to Nick Mirza with his important work from an American perspective on this. We can go back to Frantz Fanon with his account in 1961 of a certain layer in the history of colonialism. And remember, this isn't just about settler colonialism. This is about other forms of colonialism as they emerged in the late 19th, early 20th century, a form of empire that reached all the way to London and Oxford and Cambridge, that was about statues and museums and knowledge as well as bullets and bayonets. Fanon wrote of, obviously from an Algerian sort of perspective, wrote of empire, European colonialism as a compartmentalized, machinist, immobile world, a world of statues, the statue of the general who led the conquest, the statue of the engineer who built the bridge, every statue, every colonizer erected on every colonial terrain never stops repeating the same single message: we are here by the force of our bayonets. And it's again from Fanon in his important essay, Race and Culture, that we can learn and be reminded of that fact that culture as well as science was at the heart of certain forms of supremacism. This is not about whiteness on its own or racism in its simple sense as we might imagine as a problem for those people who worked in physical anthropology or biological archaeology. This is a problem that relates really to cultural whiteness and to cultural supremacism and to ideas of art as much as the human bones hidden away now in the museums. So I hope in that first sort of third or so of this talk that I've convinced you that the fallism, the restitution, and the decolonization movements are movements that we can learn from as mapping themselves onto, reacting to, seeking to deal with the legacies of a single historical phenomenon that emerged from the 1870s into the 1920s, which I'm calling militarist realism. You're very welcome to think up your own name for this thing. I'm not sure it's the best name in the world, but what was interesting to me is there really wasn't a term. It's something, it's not quite statue mania, it's not quite any of the, it's got something to do with the Gothic somewhere along the line, as an aesthetic, but we didn't have a word for it. In terms of monuments, which are about centering who it is that gets remembered and how, these are arguments that were put even earlier, and this is essentially sort of summarizing the arguments I put in this book, Every Monument Will Fall. This is an image of the cover of the paperback, which is out in a couple of months' time. We can go to Du Bois with his argument that, from 1931, the most terrible thing about war, I am convinced, is its monuments. We could go back to the other end. So he's writing at the end of my period of sort of militarist realism. We can go back earlier to the beginning and the immediate after effects of the American Civil War as a very, very important foundational moment for militarist realism. We can go back to Douglas writing about the monuments that were being called for to Robert E. Lee immediately after Lee had died. Douglas argued in 1870 that those monuments would perpetuate the warped memory of the so-called lost cause, that idea that the Civil War wasn't over. I have to say, if you look at the footage of what's happening in America at the moment, from sort of Minneapolis and across the country, there are evidently some sort of parts of America where people still think that there is a civil war going on, that there's a civil war that needs to be fought. And of course, remember that civil war, at the heart of it, was about racial equality. It was about the end of enslavement. Those monuments, according to Douglas, would reawaken the conflict by cultivating hatred. So that mixing up between memory and history, between humans and non-humans, if we want to use this, for me, very problematic sort of theoretical language that has returned into archaeology and anthropology in recent years. The image of the non-human has returned from anthropology's past without any, it seems to me, critical engagement, mixing up essentially fact and fiction in those ways and pretending that memory is history. Our task as archaeologists and anthropologists, those that work on art and architecture, is surely to ask not only what was being meant by these monuments, but how were these ideas, these ideologies, made to endure for so long. So in recent years, in the Brutish Museums and in Every Monument Will Fall, I've found myself really, developing a theoretical position on archaeology that would define our discipline as the science of human duration. Archaeology is about what survives in the present. That's why any accusation of sort of presentism makes no sense whatsoever. Archaeology, in some sense, is the very inversion, the very opposite of history. Archaeology doesn't think itself back into the past and work forward in the present. We begin with the most recent layer and we dig down. And we deal with survival, therefore, and with humanity in very distinctive ways as compared with other fields. That's the optimistic version of this discipline, this set of tools and methods which we inherit from being formalized in this period of time in the 1880s, 1890s. But of course, any tool surely is something that we can misuse, and we can use not necessarily for what it was sort of functionally intended for. And I think that's the challenge with archaeology. We're going to get to Oxford now for the bulk of this talk. And for those of you that can't, I'm sure for this audience, most people are able to imagine the Pitt Rivers Museum. Maybe I can show it you just to sort of reassure you that it's still there. And largely, continuing with the best parts of its mission. Founded 1884, this building, part, I don't know, railway station, part exhibition space. Originally, it had the glass roof that was covered over in the 1970s. A moment in the history of the museum, as I say in the book, where the lidding over of this sort of Victorian Museum of Cultural Science sort of tried to create it as, to push it back in time to an earlier kind of museum, a Wunderkammer, a cabinet of wonder, as if all the narratives of cultural improvement and supremacism sort of could be sidelined while we just hold on to a space of what there's a children's author who famously, Penelope Lively, who famously referred to the museum as the attic of the human mind. That was very much the attempt, and the partially successful attempt in the 70s and 80s, to sort of turn the museum into somewhere that would inspire writers and artists in those ways. But the colonial legacies obviously, continued in certain forms, not least on the top floor. So if you visit the Pitt Rivers, the way to visit it is to start at the top, where you have the remnants of the beginning of what this museum was as a collection, as it was founded from the 1850s. So it's a named museum, named after an FSA, after a man called Augustus Henry Lane Fox, who took the, what I call the necronym, the death name, the inherited name, Pitt Rivers, with a massive fortune, a fortune, of course, made by his immediate forebears from Caribbean enslavement to a large extent and other such activities. From the 1850s, after serving in the Crimean War, he started to create a museum of weapons. And that museum of weapons you can see very much on the upper gallery, today. These start in some ways from his original role in his military service as a young man in overseeing the adoption of the rifle as the service weapon of the British Army. So muskets and rifles are different things. The rifle has got a rifling inside the barrel of the gun, which means that it is marginally more accurate when you fire it. And his experience of being involved in the adoption of that, in the training of sort of soldiers' bodies, how to drill for musketry, both in Hythe on the Kent coast, in Malta, in the months running up to the Crimean War, and then his own experience at the front line at the Battle of the Alma in 1854. He tells that story to himself as a story of cultural, technological supremacism. The victory, the thing that makes empires succeed or fail, he argues, is something to do with their technological basis, the weapon in their hand. The fact that, that the Russian Empire is defeated by the coalition of the British Empire, the French Empire, and the Ottoman Empire is because they have more rifles than muskets as compared with the Russians. And from that, he slowly builds. And from this item, which is maybe the foundation of this theory, what he comes to call the evolution of culture, that's his term, it's what he talks about as the founding idea for the Pitt Rivers Museum, but of course turns into a founding, as he's often described as the so-called founding father for modern archaeology, the founding father for, certainly for anthropology on a four-field model as we teach it now, at South Kensington and elsewhere in London, Bethnal Green in East London, very much a pioneer of modern museums as being educational spaces, and as the first inspector of ancient monuments in this country, a key individual for thinking about monumentality. The founding of his ideas, his theories, is in some ways arguably this item, which is a musket that he brought back from the front line at the Battle of the Alma. We don't have time today to go into the arguments I make about his experience of the first sort of modern industrialized warfare in which living landscapes are transformed into archaeological sites. The dead are buried by artillery and are pushed into open graves, and the bodies are looted, and villages are turned into abandoned landscapes, into deathscapes. This is almost like the process of the formation of an archaeological site has advanced in speed so much that within a couple of hours, a living landscape can turn into something that seems like archaeology. And in many ways, I talk about in the book that way in which what maybe these days we would call shell shock of some sort, the sort of trauma of that experience gets translated into a theory of culture based on a theory of violence. Because what he starts doing is expanding out, not just for rifles and muskets, but for all the weapons he can get his hands on from the front lines of empire. In this case, in the diagram that he presents at the point at which his objects, his collection first go on display in London, at what now is the Young V&A, historically until recently the Museum of Childhood in East London in Bethnal Green, back then simply known as the Bethnal Green Museum, a new museum, sort of parachuted into East London. Last time that we parachuted a museum into East London, a bit like V&A East is about to go in, but very different in its history. He put this image on the wall and showed, in this case, objects which were weapons from a single culture, Aboriginal Australia, about which he knew nothing about their relative age. You can see the spears at the bottom, the shields on the right, the sort of clubs and the boomerangs, but he arranged them according to what he said were their series, as if object forms could evolve over time, because there's nothing quite like, he argued, the process of warfare and fighting to improve an object in terms of its technology. The boomerang gets better and better because, of course, the victors are the ones with the best boomerang in their hands. And then he generalizes that to everything. And in the Pitt Rivers, you've got, it's a typological museum, as he calls it, a museum organized by type. Again, I go down, a longer explanation of what the typological means. There's a sort of play on words here with the language of the Tractarians, with the language of the High Church Anglicans, who talk about a typological reading as being about the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And he makes this distinction between old and dying cultures and new and upcoming cultures, as if all of this were destined. And behind it all, of course, is the slow adoption of the machine gun by the British Army, which his son then uses at the Battle of Ulundi in 1879. So 1874, you see essentially a diagram of the evolution of culture based on the evolution of an imaginary wooden stick in the middle. All these other objects we can identify in the Pitt Rivers today. But his idea that they evolve, of course, is, itself a fiction of some kind. So let me now, in the second half, in the final sort of third or a little bit more of the talk to you about the objects, or get round to talking about the objects that I want to speak about sort of today. And that object is not really an object, it's a subject. Because remember that militarist realism makes us mix up our categories. And one way that it can mix us up is to start thinking that people and things, humanity and non-humanity, subjects and objects, objectification and subjectification are the same thing. The boundaries are blurred. I think we need to hold on to those terms and look at how some people are objectified and some people are subjectified. There is a kind of ultra-subjectification about the memory of the name above the door of the Pitt Rivers, which wasn't even his real name, that's there on every sign as you drive around Oxford, that guides the traffic. Pitt Rivers this way, Pitt Rivers that. There's something about the image of Cecil Rhodes, the architect intellectually of the colour line in South Africa, what is now South Africa, the diamond miner, the mass murderer, the man who, for many people, as well as having handed over large sums of money, which he made not to the University of Oxford, but to something called the Rhodes Trust, which is in Oxford, but not of Oxford. For many people, that image outside Oriel College, Oxford, is seen as a monument to the origins of apartheid and an inappropriate sort of image for the present. But think about that particular form of, the white image of the man at Oriel College. For those of you who can imagine the sort of geography of Oxford, think about that image on High Street opposite the University Church on High Street. Think about the Pitt Rivers to the north, and then triangulate back to the third point, which is Worcester College, Oxford, in which this person's body currently lies. So Augustus Pitt Rivers, after building the first collection and handing it over after unsuccessfully trying to give it to the nation, it would have been in what's now the Natural History Museum in South Kensington, but he, after falling out with everybody, he ended up sort of giving it to the University of Oxford in 1884, after inheriting all the money in 1880. He then built a second collection on his estate on the Wiltshire-Dorset border. And there's a wonderful catalogue, a very detailed catalogue of the collection which he bought, a similar size, maybe 20,000 objects or so at the time. The Pitt Rivers sort of today in Oxford has sort of grown, obviously, exponentially, and includes 300,000 objects or so. But the second collection is richly detailed on that sort of catalogue that's now in the archives at the libraries at Cambridge. And within that, there is an account of this Skull-Cup, which he purchased for 5 guineas, as you can see. It's recorded, as you will see here. If you can see can you see my mouse? You can't see my mouse. On the third line, on the third column rather, there, you can see it's in the dining room at Rushmore, which was his estate. And you can see in the detail there that he bought it at Sotheby's in 1884 from the estate of a man named Bernhard Smith, FSA. So Bernhard Smith was known by his friends and in print as the Armourer. He was known as the Armourer because, like Pitt Rivers, in his early collecting days, he collected items of arms and armour and items of torture. Within the collections is this human skull. It's a Calabria, which has been sawn off. The top of the skull has been sawn off, inverted and polished and waxed, and provided with a stem, a bit like a chalice, and with a silver rim in order to turn it into a sort of drinking cup. Now, this is a form that is known from many ethnological, historical contexts around the world, Buddhist contexts in South Asia, Australian Aboriginal contexts, and others. But the history of this person seems to be rather different, and this item, this person's body transformed into this item, seems to be different. The reason that this item sort of came to my attention was that in 2018 I was called in to Worcester College, Oxford, in order to try to help them work out what to do with this item, because until as recently as 2015, and in a tradition that started in 1946, this cup made from a human body had been used at dessert at in the senior common room, and had been at first used in order to drink wine out of, when the use and abuse of this item was so much that it started to leak. It was used to serve the chocolates in and to pass the chocolates around in. The story was it was the skull of a Caribbean enslaved woman, but that was simply what people said, what some people said. There was no circumstantial evidence. There was a name, though, on the item, on the silver rim, but it wasn't the name of, well, it turns out from the physical anthropologist, of the woman, because we're advised that the size of this and form of the skull is that it was that of a woman. A radiocarbon date has indicated that it's a woman who died at some point in the final years of the 18th century, maybe into a year or two into the 19th century. And so the date would fit with a Caribbean enslaved woman, but that certainly only remains a story. But that history, that story of who this person was something that the college wanted to understand, because it was not the name of that person, that woman, which was on the silver rim. It was the name Pitt Rivers. And that name Pitt Rivers was not a reference to Augustus Henry Lane Fox Pitt Rivers, or indeed to his son Alexander, who's the man who fought at the Battle of Ulundi with the machine gun. It was the grandson. And that grandson was a man named George Pitt Rivers, who was a fascist, a black shirt, who supported Mosley, a very, very rich man, who of course inherited the latest iteration of this vast fortune in 1927, when his father died, and was incarcerated in the war as a Mosleyite. When he was released from prison, the first thing he did when he got back to his college in Oxford was to give this item to the college and instigate this as a tradition. We can say certain things about the earlier history of the item. We can talk about the man from whose estate it was purchased, the armourer, Bernhard Smith, FSA, the son of a commander in the Royal Navy who served in the Caribbean in the early years of the 19th century. We can tell the story of how Bernhard Smith read law at Oriel College, Oxford, a total coincidence as far as I can tell, but all part of the mix, and was called the bar at London's Middle Temple. We can speculate about the meaning of the silver marks on the silver, which shows that this item in its current form was made in 1838, the year, of course, of the ending of the emancipation process in the Caribbean, but also maybe the point at which he start reading law as Oriel. We can look at the fact that there was a sovereign at the date there and at the history of the manufacture. We can look at the two lines of text, one inscribed into the skull in Greek, a line from a 6th century epigram from Julianus the Egyptian, drink ere you are clothed in this dust, and the text incised in Latin on the silver rim, which explains that it was for the benefit, for the fructus. And I talk in the book about what that word fructus means in this context by George Lane Fox, Pitt Rivers, BSc. So let me just, in the final 5 or so minutes available to me, just stop for a moment and say we're not obviously going to look at the skull now. So this becomes a history of seeing without looking. It becomes the very opposite of looking at an image of Cecil Rhodes. What the book tries to do is to hold up the image, the history, the identity, and the humanity of this dehumanized, objectified, fragmented woman's body, abused in death, which is one fate which can happen institutionally and posthumously, and those names above the door. Oxford's a place where we remove the name of the Sacklers from our galleries, as absolutely rightly did the British Museum and the Metropolitan Museum, because it turns out nobody wants to visit a gallery that's named after a drug dealer. But still, despite a democratic vote made in 2020, reaffirmed in 2021, that Oriel College governing body wished to remove Cecil Rhodes, after those votes, very slowly, nothing happened. For now, that image is there still. No one's calling for the unnaming of Pitt Rivers as a museum, but people are calling for the removal of Oxford's monument to apartheid. What I'm hoping to do, and what I've hoped to do in that book and in the course of this lecture, is to point out that we live institutionally with our disciplines, with our museums, with our public spaces in worlds in which we're constantly making choices about who we remember and who we forget. Forgetting is an active process. Dehumanization is not just failing to mention somebody. It can take a form like this. So when Worcester College absolutely made the right decision to take this object of sort of body horror out of service, I was left with the question, well, if that can carry on for so long, if that tradition can be invented so recently by someone who had only just been let out of jail as a Nazi, what else are we continuing to allow to persist in our institutional spaces? What else might be read in a similar way in the present? So this empty slide, if you go home with any image, it has to be that. And it has to be that image of not, of course, re-inscribing the violence by showing the dead body, but also have I, in this talk, simply re-centered all these dead white men, Pitt Rivers, Colston? Are they the people you're going to go home thinking about? Or are we going to somehow try to hold on to this history of this unnamed, denamed woman? There's hope, and that's where we end this talk. There's a similar set of questions being asked in London, at London Museum Docklands. I still have to get used to calling it that rather than Museum of London Docklands. London Museum Docklands, where outside it until fairly recently, there was an image by Richard Westmacott. I could talk to you all night about Richard Westmacott's role in the early art historical movement of what turned into militarist realism. His final work was the pediment outside the British Museum, the southern sort of portico as you go in, which is called, of course, is sort of themed on the rise of civilization, the emergence of civilization. Here is an early work by him of a man named Milligan, who was the chairman of the West India Dock Company, erected at his death in 1807, but taken down in 1942, because in the middle of the war, this image was in the way of what was going on at West India Docks, but then re-erected in 1999, because when they were doing up the docks and all that money was going in that sort of, Thatcherite idea to invest in Canary Wharf and all that regeneration, there's a kind of aesthetic that returned in the late 90s of sort of maritime history. Wouldn't it be nice to put the statue back up 4 years later? What was then Museum of London Docklands opened for the first time, themed on addressing honestly these histories. And then it took 17 years for the removal of that image. I was at an event at London Museum Docklands with the community last year, and in a meeting like this, and suddenly at this point in the talk, someone at the back sort of put their hand up, and they had something in a carrier bag, and they brought it to the front, and it was the cardboard sign that you see here that this man had kept for 5 years. And it's been accessioned into the museum as a kind of counter monument. And there's something about the fabric of, the physicality of cardboard being preserved and the bronze image being preserved. And we all felt, it was one of those real moments of sort of goosebumps about these histories. And then a colleague from the museum sort of punched the balloon, or whatever the word is, or reminded us. They said, that image is still in this museum. It's in the building still. That statue, it could go back up again. Someone could put it back up. It's still there. And of course, in America right now, as I say, and I've just written the preface for the paperback, they are putting the Confederate monuments that were removed under Biden back up. Okay. So what's happening, which is where the hope lies, is that there's this on the right-hand side, this image by Caleb Brooks, which will be a statue with poems by Ursa Daley Ward that flips the memory culture, that remembers not the perpetrators, but the survivors, that talks about this history and reminds people in different ways. And that surely is at the heart of this. There is surely a democratic right for societies, for communities to shape their memory culture without being told that something like listed building consent is somehow contentious, that things must never change, that a museum can never rewrite a label, that a society or a community or a city can never reshape its built environment. For me in Bristol, the most positive example of this is not the museum. It isn't Colston lying on his side, Colston right or wrong. It's the empty plinth, which is remarkable. So next time you're in Bristol, go and see it. And it's the text that was much debated, absolutely rightly. What should it say? And they've ended up with this wonderful text installed a month sort of before my book came out that just says there was this man that lived and someone put an image of him up and then they took it down. Nice and simple. Not the man did these good things and these bad things, because it's not about the man, it's about the object. It's not about the history, it's about the memory culture, the choices that we're making. So that's why the book ends, and maybe I'll end now with this, ends really with Emily Dickinson. And you only really need to read the first line of this rather wonderful fragmented poem by Emily Dickinson in order to get the point that crumbling is not an instant act. It turns out it takes quite a long time to return a looted Benin bronze or to see an image of a colonizer fall. But Rhodes did fall in 1962 in Zambia, and in 1980 in Zimbabwe, and in 2015 in Cape Town. And if you look very, very carefully at Cecil Rhodes in Oxford now, maybe you can just see that he's falling a little bit. He's a little bit less certain on his feet, but at some point, inevitably, of course, and that's the reason the book isn't called All the Monuments Must Fall. It's called Every Monument Will Fall. We make that choice. Unless we intervene, we make that choice to keep it. So who decides? What is the democratic process? I'm old enough to remember, sort of 20 years ago, when the value debate in how we managed, what we then used to call English heritage, was there, that the significance and value, the idea of conservation planning was at the heart of how we valued our economy, our heritage. And now we've lost sight of that with all this language over economic value for heritage, not foregrounding the humanity of how we remember and how we forget. So it's time, in terms of what Historic England do, that we reshape how we think about this. And that leads, of course, and my final point is that leads, of course, to how we think about ancestral human remains as well. So all this important work has to remind us that, all we've been able, and this is the punchline in some ways, if I give you my final image, the punchline is that the experts in the field, myself included, have not been able to advise Worcester College to do anything other than to put this woman's body back into the archives and to wrap her fragmented body in acid-free tissue and to put her in a cardboard box and to leave her incarcerated in the archive indefinitely. And I think that's not right. I think we can do better. I think we can do better when we multiply that across the untold hundreds of thousands of human beings, some of whom are people whose names we could find out if we did the provenance research, some of whom the violence was the denaming. The violence was very precisely the anonymization and the degradation at a time when you can hardly open a newspaper without reading about forms of abuse and dehumanization around the world, institutional forms of that. Surely we have a case to answer here as well. So the important work of the all-party parliamentary group to say we need transparency about what's in our collections. We need a ban on the sale of human remains, which is a big argument in the book, because of course Augustus Pitt Rivers, were he alive today, would be perfectly able to go and legally able to go and purchase that person's body at auction at Sotheby's if he wanted. So there is hope. These things are intergenerational movements and they take time. And let's just think hard about who gets remembered and who gets forgotten. So thank you very much. That's me.
Thank you, Dan. That's stimulating and thought-provoking. I'm grateful to you for presenting in such a passionate way these ideas. I'm going to open the floor for questions and comments. Can I just start the discussion with this sort of very disturbing case of the Worcester Cup? And I just wonder whether you've looked at the 1940s and the documentation in the college about whether there was any debate about accepting this at the time. Because with all this, we're looking at it from a 21st century perspective. And I'm interested in the extent to which these things were debated at all, or whether they were just under the passively accepted.
Okay, thank you. That's a really important point, Martin. At the time, and the archivist was the person that pointed this out to me, there weren't many fellows at Worcester College or at most of these places. So you're talking about a handful. You're talking about maybe a dozen or so men, because of course these are all male institutions until the late 70s in most cases. So this is about the history of male, it is a history of toxic masculinity in part in these institutions. It's also a history of the super rich. Because, the hope always was that, Joe would sort of see the college right, but, more wealthy in his time, arguably, than certainly a similar figure to Cecil Rhodes for that college. And a lot of things as we're learning, with Epstein, a lot of things get allowed and don't get, no one asks the questions when you're dealing with the super rich. So those are two aspects of this. There is a very simple sort of record of an accession of it. And then we're into oral history and we're into open secrets and we're into institutional whispers. And I first heard about the skull within weeks of arriving back in Oxford, having been an undergraduate there, I came back. as a lecturer back in 2007, and then it was being talked about, but yeah, not openly. So this is another case in the present where we absolutely need a case for transparency, so we can work through the ethics.
Thanks. Questions, comments? Can you wait for the mic to come around?
Okay, great. Thank you. Oh God, that's loud. Thank you, Dr. Hicks, for all of that. That was absolutely wonderful. I've read the book, The Monuments, Every Monument Will Fall. I did have a question for you, and I would like to kind of tuck into theory and this kind of like ephemeral idea of the material of these monuments in the same way that we think of a canvas. Because I was thinking through, if you wouldn't mind actually clicking through a couple to the monument that has, back a couple, the one of Colston that is now out of.
There we go. I could leave it on
Yes.
until you all get dizzy if you want. That's quite fun, isn't it?
Yes, the one actually where it's currently in the museum. Yes.
Okay.
Just so that everyone can have a visual representation of kind of the question that I have for you. I guess my question is, do you think it's possible for us as a culture to be able to view the physical manifestation of the monument as purely the canvas and view the graffiti as the new monument, and view the BLM protests in 2020 and view the reckoning that we are having as the new monument itself, and see this physical manifestation of Colston as merely the material? Do you think it's possible to still have this quote unquote on display, but have the resistance, have the response of 2020 be what is centered? Or do you think we are still at risk of someone in a couple years or in 100 years washing off the graffiti, taking away the story of 2020 and putting it back up as a monument in and of itself?
Okay, thank you so much for that question. So there's an inherent risk that people understand when they sort of promote this ideology, this what's become a slogan for politicians, or did for a while: retain and explain. Retain and explain is one perfectly reasonable approach on a case-by-case basis to how some communities or organizations may wish to deal with a problematic or hurtful monument. But it's one option among many. It can't be a mantra or a rule. Otherwise, you'd have to hold on to every single sort of garden gnome in everyone's front garden. And if you wanted to, if you bought a house and you wanted to, or moved into a house and you wanted to alter it, you'd have to, you wouldn't be able to. You'd have to write a little sign in front of the garden gnome and say, I don't really approve of this guy. It's not really my taste, but it's got a former owner once put it up, and therefore this piece of text is to remember that that's what they wanted. And then, of course, that text would inevitably decay, because the thing about, if you go to outside Oriel College, there is a little sign, but it's temporarily put up. It has a certain sort of time span. If you look the image of Rhodes in the eye, his gaze says it all. It thinks it will outlive all of us, So there's a difference there. In this case, it's really about what was being demanded for years. I mean, it was my generation that failed to see the removal of Edward Colston in the late 90s, when I was living in Bristol, in the early 2000s. There was a process to take that process through what was then English heritage and to do it all sort of legally the right way. And at every point, it was blocked. And that was why 13 years later, you ended up then with the events as they happened. But fundamentally, it's about understanding that some of these monuments are able to be hurtful. When the judge offered, in his summing up, the jury of the Colston Fort a choice in between a weighing up of the two crimes in sort of play here, on the one hand, there was the criminal damage of a public monument, and on the other, there was the hate crime of allowing that monument to stay every day that it was allowed to stand. The fact that the jury acquitted the so-called Colston Four shows that a jury understood the thing that we as a discipline, we in institutions like this, find so hard to imagine, that a monument or a statue or a museum or an academic discipline is something that could be hurtful, is something that demands more than simply always holding on to everything. There are forms of care and conservation that allow sometimes things to change in order to survive, like the cutting out of a cancer in an otherwise healthy body. So in that way, absolutely, it's case by case. That's the answer to your question. Some people might see it that way, but you know, each of this is about who decides, how do we make the decisions, who is undertaking that interpretation. Yeah, I mean, I think, as I say, one of the things I'd leave you with is just that big empty space that's left at the top of the, you know, where the image of Colston was. And that is a space, I mean, I use Sir Hartman's writing on fabulation and a number of other writers on you know, the use of the imagination to say, well, when space is opened up, when space is not being occupied in that way, there is an opportunity for the community to fill the space with a different imagination. There's something very weird. I mean, Freud would have been astonished by this extreme example of involuntary memory through which we have sort of public memory forced upon us by a loose, informal gang of late Victorians who wanted us to always have the same memories, the same memory culture that they had. And I think it's very important to hold on to that form of how to reshape, you know, in an open and a democratic way. What, you know, this isn't about tearing down all the monuments, but when communities come together and one monument is incredibly important for something to be changed, we have to take that seriously, as we do with the restitution of objects, as we do for making sure that our disciplines are in step with our times.
Was there another question? Side of the room. Can you wait for the mic to come around, because people online can't hear it?
Was your fourth M material culture?
I think it was museums, wasn't it? I missed museums. Okay. Monuments, you're testing me again now. It's been a while since I've done this talk without notes. Monumentality, memory, museums, and militarism. They're the four. There we go. Got it. Thank you.
There's one.
Hi. Thanks very much. It was really stimulating. And I was sort of thinking about your blank slide and then your comments about archaeology. And I was wondering what your thoughts were about time and progress and how the right currently in modern times looks backwards and tries to own or appropriate the past, MAGA being the obvious example. And then the left appropriate progressive as if it's moving forward. And so I was sort of thinking, is time, in your view, a similarly blank space about cultural progress dissociated from technological progress? So you end up with a sort of stasis of cultural, where you divorce it from technological. I mean, I was thinking about Lime bikes in the built environment are similar of, you know, are they a sign of the death of the petrol engine, or are they, you know, sort of ableist, anti-pedestrian view of the, you know, technology beats pedestrians. You know, you can see it either way. So it's sort of how do we see progress in the sense of time in that way?
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So absolutely, I think, you know, theories of time are at the heart of all these, you know, the four M's, now we've worked out what they are, and the four A's. And of course, you know, there are interventions in time. The museum, we imagine, is a place where we hold on to things forever. But George, Pitt Rivers, the fascist grandson, after the war, sold off the second collection. I mean, the greatest, arguably the greatest single ethnological collection that anyone ever made, because Augustus Pitt Rivers was so rich over the 16 years, 20 years or so that he assembled it. And he sold it off, and we don't know which far-right organizations were funded with the money that were given first by him and then by his partner Stella Pitt Rivers, who was also herself incarcerated in the war in France as a fascist. There are interesting parallels between Augustus Pitt Rivers FRS and Elon Musk FRS in terms of their theories of technology, in terms of their theories of the non-human, which is why this actually goes to the heart of how we teach theory, how we teach material culture theory in those ways as well. And certainly there are ways in which we can think about what we these days call heritage, which are not simply about, holding on to things for the future, but about reshape. I mean, there were 20,000 successful applications for listed building consent last year. And that included sort of 500 or so listed buildings being entirely demolished. The world changes all the time. The question is, how do we manage that change? And how do we listen to people's voices in that? So we are very sort of privileged in the 4 A's and all these institutions like sort of museums, and the monumental, whereby we can think and shape how we experience time. But all archaeologists know that there are many forms of the monumental. I mean, monumentality isn't just the general on the horse. It can be Stonehenge, or for indigenous communities, it can be a tree or a lake or a natural feature. So there are many, many other ways of engaging with time, inheritance. And I guess one of the ways there, which just to make the main point, is that how we inherit from the past is actually absolutely central here. So the scientists, those people that have actually been rather better than the people who work on culture at recognizing the racism in their own discipline and saying this is bad science, as they did in the 20th century, what do they tell us today? They tell us that our main job is how to be, as a society, a good ancestor, how we leave a world behind for those who come after us, which is not full of toxic waste and overheated environment and high water levels that mean that small island states are disappearing and so on. What does that mean for those of us in culture? It means the other side of the coin. We need to learn to be good descendants. We need to learn to inherit well from these institutions, from these ideas, from these disciplines, but not hold on to everything where that stuff is hurtful or out of step with our times. So it's a way of, at the heart of this, ultimately, this is a question of what we choose to keep, who decides about that, and how to be a good descendant.
Dan, that's a fine note to finish on. Can we thank Dan again for a splendid talk? I give notice that the next meeting will be on Thursday, the 26th of February, when we will hear a paper, The Bamborough Bowl Hole, a bioarchaeological and isotopic investigation of a Royal Anglian period cemetery by our director, Sam Lucy. Meeting stands adjourned. Please join us for a drink outside.